Okay, thank you very much for your contributions to the discussion. Since we have a special guest, we will have a special lecture, I hope. What I would like you to do, if you could permit me, would be to try and finish the substantive part of the course, the theoretical part of the course. I'll be introducing you to problem solving and critical perspectives on human security. And if I have time in the last 30 minutes, I would like to outline my own work on post-secular human security. So since post-secular human security is a contribution to a debate on critical human security, I think we can look at the lecture holistically. So I hope that the lecture flows. So rather than thinking of it as two lectures, I think we should think of it as one. In order for me to do this, though, I need your cooperation. You have already spoken for 1 hour, almost uninterrupted. So if you have any questions, I would like them to be questions, not comments. So I will pause if you have any questions for clarification. You've had an opportunity to tell me your opinions. You'll have another opportunity to tell me your opinions and your questions in the first 30 minutes we'll be having next class. So if you could just limit yourselves to questions and questions of clarification rather than comments. Thank you very much. We will start by basically reviewing what we have done on human security so far for the benefit of our special guest. So firstly, let us look at human security. What is our generic working definition of human security according to the UN General Assembly? So I privileged one understanding of human security above all others. What is this? You still, same rules apply. Introduce yourself and put on the microphone. Yeah. Okay, freedom from fear and freedom from want is the Commission on Human Security definition, and that is with freedom to make decisions on one's own behalf. But I'm looking mainly at operationalizing the UN General Assembly understanding of human security, which admittedly is very contradictory, but there is, the first line of it is less contradictory than others. So, Mavish, you had your hand up? Mavish? Yes. Are you going to say the same thing? Anyone else? I'll accept that. Good. So according to the UN General Assembly, human security may be defined as the right of people to live in freedom and dignity. So freedom, of course, in this sense means freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom to. Notice freedom to. So we looked at the difference between freedom from and freedom to in the last lecture. This comes from Sir Isaiah Berlin. So freedom from is freedom from having something done to you. So ontologically, this is a position based on the idea that you are secure. You are naturally secure. Something needs to be done to you in order for you to feel insecure. Whereas if we look at freedom to make decisions on your own behalf, this means that you are enabled. You perhaps need to be empowered in order to realize the choices which are available to you. Okay, so we've dealt with freedom. We have not yet dealt with dignity, but I hope we will deal with dignity later. But just out of general interest, what is your understanding of dignity?
Self-respect.
Okay, but how can others affect your self-respect? This is a philosophical question. So, yes, it's possible if we look at psychology, but, yep. I think that's closer rather than self-respect. Self-respect, I agree, but it's quite complicated. The idea of respect for others. I think, can be an understanding of dignity. But we're not dealing with dignity so far, but at least we have an understanding of what dignity is. So when I teach, let's say, in Japan or South Asia and East Asia, they wouldn't really have an understanding of dignity. They have the term sonkan, but it has a different connotation, certainly with the idea of dignity within the West. We will look at this later. This is particularly important if we look at post-secular approaches to human security. Okay, now again, for the benefit of those who may not have been with us earlier, what are the two approaches which I have outlined? What was the first approach, and how can we summarize it? And what does the Nauru approach define human security as? Okay, not at the same time. Okay, who has their microphone on right now? Shani, go. Okay, I'll take that. Nauru approach is human security as protection from violent threats. These violent threats are violent physical threats. Yeah, so it looks at Galtung's concept of direct violence. Okay, now I'm only going to take a contribution from this side of the room on the other approach. What other approach have we looked at? Okay, and who would like to define the broad approach? Please put your hands on your buzzers now. Okay, Priya. Okay, how could we put it? I mean, I'm a bit worried about capacity building because, for a start, it's mainly capability. When we look at capacity building is a term used in the narrow approach to human security, particularly when we look at the responsibility to protect. The idea is that state's capacity needs to be enhanced in order for them to protect the individual. Yeah, so how would we? I wouldn't say no. It's not prioritizing. It's saying empowerment and protection. What were you going to say? Yeah.
It's freedom from fear and want in order to maintain the empowerment. In order to bring the empowerment.
No. You need to be empowered in order to be free from fear and free from want. So it's first empowerment, which is necessary. Okay. We looked at the vital core, the protection of the vital core, which means the protection of vital freedoms, which include freedom from fear and freedom from want. The objective is the protection of the vital core of all human lives in ways that enhance human freedoms and human fulfillment. So the argument here is that protection is not enough. In order to protect human security, we need to empower people to see the decisions. We empower people to see the choices available to them so that they cannot make their decisions themselves. So that's why empowerment is important. Now, notice the idea of human security is not taken for granted. So we are not secure unless somebody threatens us. Human security here is a project. We don't live in a secure environment. We need to live in a secure environment, which means that we need to empower others so that they're able to make decisions on their own behalf. Okay, any questions of clarification on this? This is what we've done so far on human security. So if there are any questions, yep, Mom, yep.
Again, I'm Giorgio Safari, doing PhD in English department. My question is about an issue that our state, Iran, is suffering from, and it is local and also a global issue, that is the drug trafficking or drug transit, because we are the neighbor of Afghanistan, so we are the way of transit of drugs from Afghanistan to Europe, and our people also suffering from drugs. So my question is that is drug trafficking or this drug transit is which approach deals with this? It's narrow approach or broad?
I think you're in a position to answer it yourself. I want to empower you. I think I have empowered you by talking about the narrow and broad approach, so you can maybe answer your own question. Which approach do you think?
I think it's narrow.
Why?
Again, because of the, so we have the individuals that are suffering from the, this kind of problem.
Well, then I have a question for you. If we look at drugs, is somebody forcibly injecting them, or are they injecting themselves? Are they taking drugs themselves, or is somebody drugging them? I think that's an easy way to look at the difference.
It's difficult to see, it can be both.
Then it can be both. So if it's both, which approach is it? If it's both broad and narrow, what approach is it?
Yeah, that's why I had the question, because according to the definition of a broad approach and in the Canadian term, so I think it was a narrow approach.
Yeah.
But now, again, it was a question for me that it's...
Yeah, but my point is, if it can be both narrow and broad, what is it? You can't have narrow and broad. That doesn't make sense. If it's narrow and broad, what logically would it be? Broad. So then it's broad approach. If it can be broad, then it's a broad approach. It's broader than a narrow approach.
We have a key term here, a key word, that is control. Who can control this, this issue. So if the state control, then it is, again, a narrow approach. If the state control...
No, I think, okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this argument, but this can even be seen as a national security issue. If drugs are coming into Iran from Afghanistan, then it's an external threat. So this is, if you look at the United States and Mexico, this is an argument for America to be more involved in the Mexican drug wars, which is most of the drugs comes into the United States from Mexico. So this could even be seen as a national security issue. So my point is, it's a very good example. I think it's probably a broad approach to a non-traditional security threat. It's best encompassed within a broad approach to human security. But it really depends on the argument which you would like to make. So this is an example, but the argument is important, not the actual threat itself. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to introduce you, and I think this is quite a good example which will allow me to do so, to introduce you to two different understandings of human security. And following the work of the Frankfurt School of Social Theory, and particularly Horkheimer, and also Robert Cox in the Literature and International Relations, I would like to make a distinction between problem-solving and critical perspectives of international relations. Now let's look at the difference between problem-solving and critical theory. So the Frankfurt School of Social Theory, it wasn't like a school like the JMI School. It was a school of thought, which actually emerged in the 1920s and 30s within Germany, and in many sense it became an intellectual school of thought which influenced other schools of thought, most notably the New School in New York afterwards. So the Frankfurt School theorists, I wouldn't say mainly Jewish theorists, but many of them were Jewish theorists, such as Horkheimer, Adorno, Benjamin, distinguished between traditional and critical theory. I think it's worthwhile making the point that for Frankfurt School theorists, they were interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. So this is a great venue for a lecture or a seminar on critical theory. Many of them were, such as Walter Benjamin, were literary critics or music critics. But they could still make a distinction between traditional and critical theory. Traditional theory referred to those theories which try and explain how the world works within prevailing power structures. So they take the world for granted. And within this, we have to solve a particular issue. So for Robert Cox, writing Millennium in 1981, he was perhaps the first to look at this distinction and to apply it to international relations. Traditional theory was a problem-solving theory. So it sought to solve problems employed by what he termed hegemonic social forces. Now, Cox was very influenced by Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist. Which concept have we looked at in the course which has been influenced by Gramsci? Hegemony. What can we define hegemony as? What's your understanding of hegemony?
Along with the consent.
Coercion and consent. Yeah. This is different from dominance. It's coercion and consent. So hegemonic social forces, hegemonic social forces are those forces which are able to naturalize their particular worldview so it appears as common sense. Now, if we're to look at international relations, what would an example of a hegemonic social force be? What's our main example of a hegemonic social force? The state. Excellent. But not just the state. Remember, Cox is influenced through Gramsci by Marxist thought. So what else can be seen as a hegemonic social force? You have to, sorry? Yeah, but these are beliefs, values, and ideas of whom? Oh, what are these elites? Who are these elites? Correct. Capitalist elite. Capitalist elite. So you mentioned capitalism. The dominant classes, I think, is correct. Yeah. So if we look at the dominant classes, arguably within India, you could talk in terms of dominant castes and classes. Certainly until now. These can be seen as hegemonic social forces. What else can be seen as hegemonic social forces? Huh? Yeah, I want to look at religion later. I think this is really, really interesting. So let's keep religion aside, but if we look at Gramsci's view, then certainly the Catholic Church within Italy played the role of naturalizing the views of the ruling classes. This was Gramsci's argument. This is why he was very anti-religious in this sense. So he compared Italy with other industrialized societies and saw that those in the south of Italy who were in most need of revolution were least likely to be communist because they were very religious. And the Catholic Church at the time tended to naturalize the worldview of the ruling classes. But what else? If we not look at religion, who else can we see, or what else can we see as a hegemonic social force? Hegemonic social forces produce ideologies. So it's not ideologies themselves. We're talking about, from a Marxist perspective, material things. Well, media is good. Yeah, media is good, but media, again, is a reflection of, media is controlled by social forces, yeah? No, it's just, then we get into... Sorry? No. Norms are hegemonic. They can't be hegemonic. We're looking at hegemonic social forces. So a social force will be a collection of people. So you mentioned civil society. I didn't want to look at civil society, but civil society is important within Gramsci because civil society, for him, is not separate from the state. Civil society is that area where non-state actors can reproduce the dominant values and ideologies of the state. So So that's why I didn't want to look at civil society, because they're different understandings of it. But looking over there in particular, what else can be seen as a hegemonic social force? Or Priya, yeah, go ahead. No, come on. Military, police, that's the coercive apparatus. What else? This is your chance to include something you wanted in the course. Yes. Hegemonic social forces could be patriarchy. So you could make the argument for the state itself being patriarchal. These are all examples of hegemonic social forces. Now, my question to you is, if we apply traditional theory to international relations, and in particular to the study of security, which perspective, which we have looked at, appears to be influenced by traditional theory, and why? Very good. National security paradigm. Why? Okay, excellent. Yeah, I would agree with this. And definitely Robert Cox would agree with this. So for him, realism in particular, realism and neo-realism in particular were expressions of the theory of international politics, which are articulated by hegemonic social forces. Why? Because they take the prevailing power structures throughout the world for granted. A world which is structured along the lines of there being territorially bounded sovereign states. So they take the world as they see it. And within that, they attempt to solve problems. So if we go back to the problem of drugs, a traditional approach will be to say, this is a problem. We need to solve this issue within the prevailing power structures. The prevailing power structures will need to operate border police to try and make sure that drugs don't come into our particular society. So this will be an example of traditional theorizing within international relations. It's seen as an external threat coming through the borders. We have to stop it. Okay. Now, the important idea here is problem-solving theory. So when we look at human security later, what we can do is basically go back to our list of non-traditional security threats and see if we can solve them within the prevailing system. However, what happens if we can't solve them logically? What would happen if we can't solve a particular issue within the prevailing power structure? What logically should take place? Yeah, a new security architecture will be required. So then we'll need to change some of the assumptions upon which the theory is based. So this is what really critical theory looks at. Critical theory is explicitly normative. It attempts not only to explain the world. The neo-realism as a theory, the national security paradigm, attempts to explain the world as it is. It is not an explicitly normative theory. But critical theory, as a normative theory, attempts to change the world, to transform existing power structures by looking for the possibilities for liberation, freedom, emancipation that are immanent within existing political and social relations. So here, what do we mean by immanent? This is italicized. Not within a religious meaning, but what do we mean by immanent here? Yep, please, do you have your hand up? No? What does imminent mean? This is the key to critical theory. Yeah, I like the idea of possible. Sorry? Prevailing. Yeah, that's. I like possible, prevailing. Okay. What else?
It's going to be changed, like.
Sorry?
It's going to be changed, which is something impending.
Yeah, I think you've broadly got it. Anybody else?
Existing or doing within has to
Very good. Yeah.
we need to put our light on the idea.
Yeah, I think we need a fuller explanation here. So something with imminent is something which is already contained within that idea. So something which is already contained within a particular political moment, but which can give birth to a new social form. So it has to be there already. It's different from something which is utopian. Because if you're looking at something which is utopian, then you are trying to create the world anew. So we're only looking for what is there and trying to use our resources in order to have a more progressive change. Okay, any questions on the difference between problem solving and critical theory? Yep.
Is giving a space to the subaltern can be considered as an imminent a space. I mean, to have access to power, so it can be considered as an imminent.
Absolutely, yes. I think this is an excellent example, yeah. Yep.
When you say the traditional theory works by explaining how the world is, what is the use of the theory by just explaining everything knows how to work, like what is happening in the world, and
Sorry, so I think there's an assumption there. Could you go back? Could you explain?
it's like there is anyone who says traditional theory is a theory which tries to explain how the world works within the prevailing power structures.
Yeah.
Right. So it only defines how the world works, or does it give any solution to why does it work like that? And if it is working like that, then what is to be done? If to correct it in case it's not working right.
What were you going to say?
What is the point of this theory? Because if you
The point of which theory?
the traditional theory, because you are only explaining what already exists in the world. What for?
No, I think you missed the idea of what is the point of traditional theory is that traditional theory is theory. It doesn't call itself traditional theory. It calls itself theory. It's critical theorists who come along and say, this is traditional theory. Yep. Put the microphone on. Very good. Critical is what? Well, definitely traditional is critical theory. What were you going to say, Peter? What? Yeah.
But what traditional theory does is, if there is an event that takes place, so there is a particular phenomenon, so that is the whole idea of appropriating it within this traditional framework.
Yep.
That maintains the status quo.
Absolutely. Yep.
It's not so much about explaining, but
It's more about theorizing.
exactly.
Yeah, I think the point to note is when we use terms like hegemony, when we use terms like hegemonic social forces or traditional theory, this is a type of language which those hegemonic social forces which critical theorists are critiquing would not acknowledge, even ideology. So they would say, look, this is natural. Realists would say, we're not interested in changing the world. In the words of E.H. Carr, the world is, well, the purpose of international relations is to describe the world as it is, not as it ought to be. What critical theorists are saying is if you say that something is, you're also prescribing, you're also saying it ought to be like this. So the argument is that traditional theory itself is normative. But the difference is the norms are implicit in traditional theorizing. So when we look at realism or neorealism, whereas within critical theory, it's explicit. Okay, so let's look at human security as a problem-solving theory. So, to recap, a problem-solving theory would attempt to solve a particular issue within the prevailing power structures. How is the world structured? What is the basic unit of international political life? The state, the sovereign state. So then how can we solve problems within an international society of sovereign states? Collective global existential problems, the sort of non-traditional security threats which he looked at in the third and fourth lectures. How can we solve them? How do we bring them together? What's the arena? Yeah, very good. So mainly through the United Nations system, through regional organizations such as ASEAN, arguably SAARC, definitely NATO. Remember what we mentioned last time. NATO still exists, and human security is a key role in its existence because the definition of security has been broadened to such an extent that NATO itself is committed to certain ideas which have been influenced by human security. So we've had the institutionalization through the UN system, through the Trust Fund for Human Security. Many states, Many states, such as the Japanese government, previously the Canadian government and the Thai government, arguably, if Hillary Clinton had won the election within the United States, there could have been a US government commitment to human security. Within Japan, it is a basic policy goal. So the fact that the Japanese government has human security as a basic policy goal for its official development assistance means that human security is why you have a metro system in Delhi. So it's basically human security which has enabled the funding by the Japanese government in order to get a metro system within Delhi, because traffic is seen as an existential threat to all of your existences. So in order to do it, they needed to construct a metro system. Question? Can I get to the end of the slide? Then you can have questions. The adoption by the UN General Assembly, Resolution 6 of the Session 66 to 190. The General Assembly of the United Nations is committed to an understanding of human security. What this means is that states publicly acknowledge that their sovereignty is conditional on their ability to protect and empower the people under their territories which they control. So it has some international normative power or force. And I think if bringing this up to date, we can detect the influence of the language or perhaps the discourse, coming back to the ideas of discourse or narrative, which we looked at in the first lecture, on the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and particularly the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations, HIPPO, in 2015. So we see the adoption of many human security goals. So what has happened basically is that we have human security has been addressed through the prevailing power structures by individual states such as Japan and Canada, but most importantly by the United Nations system, by the General Assembly, by the Trust Fund, by UN OCHA, and it has influenced Sustainable Development Goals and the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations. So in this sense, human security as a problem-solving theory now has a institutional architecture with which to solve problems. Okay, what are the problems with problem-solving theory? Well, what question did you have earlier?
security, for example, the second point, the Japanese government commitment to human security is a basic goal, basic policy goal, which I think it means that you have to consider human security in all the policies that you're formulating, right?
You have to what?
You have to consider the element of human security in all the policies that are being formulated by the government, right? But my question is that when you say that this is being considered, does that act as a hindrance in the way of development? Because, for example, when you say, if you look at the metro construction here in Delhi, if you're constructing the metro, you'll have to displace some people living out there. So, in that case, you will have to somewhere, adjust with the human security and development. So, you'll have to choose one, either human security or development. When you say you won't be looking at the rights of the people who are living, who are falling in the way of the development goals that are being achieved.
Sir, same case with the tribes.
Did you put it up?
Sorry, it's not working. Sir, I am along with her because same case along with the tribes of Chhattisgarh and Odisha. Dams are being constructed and they have been expelled out. The tribes, the indigenous people have been expelled out from their origins and their places, and they have not been given the rehabilitation and any help by the government. This is organized by the state. This is organized by the state government.
Is the basic state government goal development or human security?
So that is what we want to know. Like, when you say...
That's the heart, so...
Actually, sir, we want to know, is there any kind of... Seriously, this is a kind of development, or it is the obstacle in the path of the indigenous people, those who cannot live their life just because of organized...
So basically, when you say human security, you are only talking about, you're just talking about it on papers. But when you come to implement the very idea of development and human security, it actually turns out to be adjusting, or I would say compromising with the rights of those who actually need human security.
And sir, that's why...
You didn't get it?
I think both of you are saying completely different things
No, sir.
on the same microphone, but never mind.
So basically, we are talking about displacement as one important human right.
Yeah, no. Okay, let's first start. We have not looked at human rights in this course so far, and there's a reason. There's another course we could do on human rights. Secondly, my question was just whether the displacement was in the name of development or human security.
Sir, on the name of development.
Exactly. So in this sense, if we go back to your question, human security is not a hindrance, because human security within this sense could be actually an argument made against development.
Sir, and what about those people, those who have been displaced and...
So when you're making...
That's the point I'm
I have a
saying.
point. When you're making a point against development, when you say that you're making a point against development,
Yes.
and that is human security.
Yes.
So you indirectly what you're saying is that if you want to achieve development, you cannot achieve human security. Is it like that?
Yeah, hang on.
Because at times you have to compromise one of these, right? It's not always that you can achieve human security and development as well. Because in the case of
What you have pointed to is something which we'll look at later, which is the difference between security and development and the securitization of development. But I think in the examples given, human security actually could be used against development. So there's a powerful argument for saying that the Delhi metro system is a source of insecurity rather than just security. So that's an argument which can be made. But the point to make, the real problem here is the adoption of human security, which is a holistic concept by a sovereign state. So once you have sovereign states committed to human security, what's the difference between human security and national security? This is a nationalization of human security. I think this is the more important critique of human security as a problem-solving approach. If you're trying to make the point that human security should be a holistic concept, a universal concept, then it needs a different security architecture. As soon as states start adopting human security and formulating policies around human security, then this, in many senses, negates the emancipatory promise of human security. and the way it challenges prevailing power structures. This would be the view from a critical perspective. Okay, let's continue with human security as a problem-solving theory. So what generically can you think of as a problem of looking at human security as a problem-solving theory from a critical perspective? Particularly if you look at the developments you've outlined here today, tribal areas within South Asia. What are the problems here of human security, of using human security? We've looked at the Delhi metro system. So the Delhi metro system is made possible by the Japanese funding to the Delhi metro system is made possible by the Japanese government's basic commitment to human security as a basic policy goal. So what problems can you see with it generically from a critical perspective? Yep, Preeta?
I think the main problem that we can see regarding human security is when we have a heterogeneity of culture and class in terms of addressing the problems of the population. So I think the diversity plays a very important part in thinking of human security. It becomes a problem.
I would completely agree with that, but let's look at it within the prevailing system itself before we get to that argument. I think there's another argument to be made before we can get there. Yep.
It may be disparities. It may be disparities on the basis of caste, economic, or the cultural basis.
Could you elaborate? What would be disparities? We're looking at...
Discrimination on the basis of finance. Disparities will lead to, or discrimination will lead to the problems.
Yeah, but how is this a problem with problem-solving the approach to human security?
If discrimination is met, it is solved, then there will be no problem.
But can it be...
Class over class.
But can it be solved within the prevailing system? Can India solve the issue of, I don't know, if we are to look at caste, for example, as a system of structural violence? I'm not saying that caste is a system of structural violence, but if we are to look at it as a system of structural violence, can the state do so? Can the state liberate people from the structures of violence of caste within India? Why not? Sorry, could you speak a bit louder? Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. But if we could go back to my original question, holistically, I've introduced you to human security at both the narrow and broad approaches. So if we are to take human security holistically as encompassing both the narrow and broad approaches, what is the problem with looking at human security as a problem-solving theory? We've isolated one problem here, which is we've looked at India. Can the state of India liberate people from the structural violence of caste?
Spoken about the state playing its role, whereas it does not mention the role of other regional organizations like NGOs. Because the state individually cannot go ahead and solving the problem of the people. So I think it does not mention the role of these regional organizations.
Yeah, but when we look at human security as a problem-solving theory, it also encompasses the United Nations system, regional organizations. All of them, in a way, are committed to human security. If you look at most international non-governmental organizations, human security is inscribed in their charters as a basic policy goal. I've had students who work for NGOs studying with me in Japan saying, I really wanted to take a course in human security because we were committed to human security, but we didn't know what it was. So in this sense, human security is, what's the danger of using human security then? If we look at it as a problem-solving theory, what is the danger of INGOs using it, of states using it, of international institutions using it, of powerful states using it? Good. Very good. I think the focus is correct. The focus is on putting it on paper. Once we put it on paper, what does it become? It becomes a law, but not if it's a basic policy goal. But if we think back to the first couple of lectures, what can we talk? How can we conceptualize human security once it's written down, once it's codified, once it's entered the media? What does it become? Peter?
There are rules and laws, but they don't followed by the people. It happens in most of the cases.
Now let's be a bit more cynical. What happened? Sorry. What was your question?
Sir, I think
Okay. What? Okay, no more points. The point I'm trying to make is if we're trying to be critical of human security as a problem-solving theory, then shouldn't we just be looking at the narrative itself? Shouldn't we be just looking at how human security is written down? What does it become when it's written down? Forget about within a political system because it needs ratification. Huh? I'm looking at a more technical term like narrative. No, you're all problem solvers. No. Okay, the point I'm trying to make is like happiness within Bhutan, it becomes a discourse. It becomes a narrative which the state can use. So again, let's go back to my example of the Delhi metro system. So Japan wanted to give money to the state of India so that government of India, so India could build the Delhi metro system, mainly because it's built along the lines of the Tokyo metro system. And this is good for Japan and good for Japanese businesses, particularly when we look at repair work. But the point is they needed an discourse, a way in which they can justify this policy. The way they used this policy was human security. But was this really a policy which brought around about people's human security? As we saw in the previous discussion between you two over there, we see that people were displaced by the metro system. So human security itself led to human insecurity. So in this sense, the danger is that human security becomes that which the state tells us. It's the state which has a monopoly of the definition of human security. And it's intrinsically linked to the state. So whereas human security identifies the state as an agent of insecurity in theory, in practice, it strengthens the role of the state. I think that's perhaps the most important critique to make of human security. Now, what I would like to do is to change our focus and our level. So far, our discussion has been on the level of the state. But what does this do internationally? remember, we're looking at the narrow and broad approaches to human security. So globally, what does having human security ratified by the UN General Assembly make possible? Think again of Libya. What does this make possible? What? You have to.
Peace can make it possible.
If human security makes peace possible, then there's no critique of human security as a problem-solving theory. It's fine.
Independence of international organizations.
Sorry?
Independence of international organizations, like the UN itself.
And what would they do?
I think they intervene into the government's functioning and actually take over.
What do we call this if they take over a government's functioning? Huh? Okay, we can call it humanitarian intervention. This is definitely the term which is used in the UN literature, but we are in South Asia. What did the British used to call it? Imperialism. And how did the British, again looking at discourses and narratives, how did they legitimize empire? They never really called it empire. What did they call it from the 1980s onward, 1880s on? Huh?
Civilizing,
At last, we're here. So human security as a civilizing mission. So I think this can be seen as in my view, a powerful critique of human security. So again, let's go back to Cox. So he's saying that that problem-solving theories take prevailing power structures in the world for granted as the status quo. And they seek to solve problems within the given structures. If we do the same with human security, what we're doing is we're preserving the structures which have given rise to human insecurity in the first place. So human security as a discourse allows hegemonic social structures to extend their power and control over everybody's lives, over everyday life. So in this sense, whoops, gone the wrong way. Human security, HS, seeks not only to protect, but to empower the individual who is freed from the shackles of culture and religion. So remember the idea of the civilizing mission, when we look at colonialism, it's based on the idea that there are some people who are civilized and others who are uncivilized. And that the British, if we look at Bengal in the 1830s and the 1840s, when you had the practice of sati, the idea here was that there are some practices which are seen as uncivilized. And because these are barbaric practices, you need the extension of government legislation over people's lives and over people's bodies. So human security here seeks not only to protect, but to empower the individual from the broad approach who is freed from the shackles of culture and religion. Culture and religion are the problems. So we need, if we look at I'm staying in the Nehru guest house. If we look at Nehru's ideas of the tryst with destiny, it was a project. It was to try and free South Asians from religion and culture, to make them more, to seek progress. Development was a way of fulfilling this tryst with destiny. So there are obvious parallels here if we look at the language used, not just by states, but by international organizations, and most particularly by non-governmental organizations, international governmental organizations. There are parallels with the civilizing mission, which sought to impose a cultural conversion of non-Western states to a Western civilizational standard. This is in the word of John Hobson. This is my understanding of what really the civilizing mission was about. The civilizing mission was a form of imperialism, but it does not necessarily have to take the political structure of colonialism. You don't need colonialism to have a civilizing mission. Here, what the objective is to bring about an assimilation. So assimilation on a universal global scale. Now, as mentioned earlier, and this is where I'd like to, to expand. Particularly the cultural dimensions of human security are ignored. As soon as we posit, and this is, I think, perhaps my contribution or one of my contributions to the literature, once we posit a universalistic understanding of what human security is, of what human rights is, of what human development is, irrespective of whether it's a Western aid worker, whether it's a political theorist like John Rawls, or whether it's even Amartya Sen and Mahabubul Haq, what we are doing is prioritizing one particular cultural tradition and standpoint. And we are universalizing it. So the cultural dimensions of human security are ignored as, remember this term, the unencumbered individual. The unencumbered individual means an individual freed from attachments to society, to family, to religion, etc., is reduced to what Agamben, and I will expand on this, argued was bare life. Bare life here means, as we'll see later, just the physical act of existence. And this is the target of human security and human rights and human development, to protect bare life. Please allow me to continue and explain what I mean by this. So conventional discourses on human security consider the individual to be the basic unit of humanity. However, the cultural context within which the individual realizes her or his own identities is not taken into account. The argument I'm making is that the individual does not exist. Now, this is a psychological argument as well as a philosophical point. How do we come into being? I'm not talking about physically, how we come into being. I think that's pretty uncontroversial now. But how do we come into being as social beings? Through what process? Yeah, dialectics, but explain what's dialectic? Huh? Sorry, socialization, but could you please explain? I think I agree, but what do you mean by that? Excellent. Let's go back to probably one of the first questions I asked earlier in the course, which is when we look at external sovereignty, how does a state become a state? Through what process? It's the same with human beings, through recognition. So socialization, correct. But the prior process is recognition. You need to be recognized as a human being in order to be a human being. I think this is where, when we look at bonded labor, slavery, etc., this is particularly important. Because the argument is not that people were not human, but people were not recognized as human. So this process of recognition constitutes the individual human subject. Now, Agamben, in his work, and it's been used quite widely in the literature, not just by me, goes back to Aristotle's distinction between bare life, the physical act of living, and the idea of the bios, a qualified life. So if you go back to the Athenian city-states, everybody was human, including women and slaves. But women and slaves did not have the vote. They could not own property. They were not treated with dignity. It was the political life which endowed the individual male slave-owning Athenian with a bios. Everybody else was just an object, bare life. Now, what Agamben has done in his work, philosophical work, as basically to say that the objective of human rights and the objective of modernity is to produce this valorization of bare life, where what we're really concerned about is just individually living, individually surviving. Now, I think the point which I would like to make is that an objective of a critical approach to human security should not just be to say, can we bring about human security within the prevailing power structure, but what is the objective of human security? Are we by seeking to free people from fear and want, how are we regarding human beings? Are human beings objects to be rescued? Or are human beings themselves agents of their own empowerment? And this, I think, is one of the problems of the literature on empowerment. It assumes that there are those over there, third world peoples, Dalits, women, etc., who need to be empowered. That's their problem. They need to be empowered. If you look at the discourse on Islamic radicalization in the West, it's about backwardness within Muslim communities, within Europe. It's not, or educational, lack of educational achievements, lack of gender equality. It's not about foreign policy. So in the United Kingdom, they had a whole report on radicalization which did not mention once that the primary reason for radicalization was the British government's decision to actively support and participate in the invasion of Iraq. So, this is an example of objectification of others, which comes through the idea of empowerment. The objective of this policy is to empower people so they can see the choices which are available to them. So by objectifying human beings as bare life, what we're doing is robbing them of any possibility of agency, any possibility of controlling their own lives and their own destiny. And this is a way of just focusing on the individual as bare life rather than bios. Bios means a flourishing life. And there are a couple of case studies which I would like to try out, because I've used them, I've used them in the West and I've used them in Japan. But I always bring in South Asia because I think this is an important point to make. If you are starving and there is only, or if not, I won't say starving, but if you're malnourished and there's only beef or pork for you to eat, would you run the risk of dying or just eat beef or pork and survive? Huh? What? You would eat it. Okay, you're all materialists. But the point I'm trying to make is that our ideas, our beliefs, constitute us. So if we look at, even Gandhi during the national movement, the amount of times in which he went on hunger strikes, and I can think of other figures from different religions who also went on hunger strikes. You had self-immolation during the nationalist period and also after the nationalist period. Why would people in this position put their own lives at risk? Why do people sometimes take their lives? Or why do people decide to sacrifice their lives for others?
For the rights.
Due to their divine faith, belief.
Due to what?
Divine faith. Is their belief in the...
Yeah, because in this sense, there's an idea that your faith constitutes you. There is something greater than just bare life. And I think this has not really been taken account in the literature. It's to look at the idea of where Agamben is coming from. He's intervening in certain debates which were initiated by Michel Foucault on the idea of biopolitics. So biopolitics is different from geopolitics. Geopolitics looks at territory. Biopolitics looks at life itself. So Foucault made a difference between sovereign power, the power of the state, and biopower, the power over individual human beings. The first, the power of the state, or the power of the sovereign, was the right to let live and to make die. In other words, the right to kill and the right to let somebody live. The sovereign is the person who, following Carl Schmitt, makes a decision. So you have a decision which you need to make. Does that person live or die? Biopower is different. Biopower is the ability to make live and to let die. So to make live means by providing people with sanitation, with clean water, with food, you're prolonging their life. This is the objective of human development. But also, you can let them die. You can let them die by saying, okay, we're not going to intervene here. We're not going to let them have access to sanitation, etc. So one of the great critiques of the literature on biopolitics, I think, which is unfair because Foucault actually makes the distinction within his work, is that biopolitics was just not used within the colonies. This is Partha Chatterjee's argument on colonial governmentality. We can't talk in terms of biopolitics or governmentality in the colonies because what the British and the French did was not to extend the same rights to citizenship or the same social and economic rights to their subjects. So in that sense, they made live people within their metropolitan societies within Britain and France and Portugal, and they let the others die in this sense by denying them the same rights which they were extending to people within their own societies. So I think that this is, in my view, a pretty powerful critique of an entire way of liberal theorizing, which objectifies the individual and strips the individual of any agency and any understanding of a social or cultural dimension to her or his existence. Okay, if I may, I would like to continue on to critical human security, but you'll have a chance to talk, to ask me questions about bare life tomorrow. So the argument which critical theorists make when we look at critical human security is that human security is a problem-solving concept deployed without reference to the everyday security of vulnerable peoples. This comes from Giorgio, who used to be rector of the United Nations University. So I think our example of people within Delhi being displaced to make the metro exemplifies this. So it's a problem-solving concept. We need to create a metro system within Delhi because it would lead to the long-term benefit, the long-term human security of people living in Delhi. Traffic congestion would be cut down. How do we do this? Well, somebody, going back to biopolitics, somebody needs to leave their land. There's somebody, the majority perhaps benefit, but a minority have to leave.